Good afternoon. Welcome to another lecture in the series Perspectives on Economic Liberty, hosted by the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty here at ASU. My name is Ross Emmett, and I'm a director of the center and a professor of political economy in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. The Perspectives series emerges from the center's mission to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. And one of the ways we fulfill that mission is to invite a variety of guests who interrogate our center's topic by revisiting past debates, evaluating economic liberty's contribution to human betterment for good or ill, and to consider its relationship to other human values and to the freedoms that we hold. Our guest today is Dr. Lant Pritchett, Director of the Research on Improving Systems of Education. The acronym is RISE. In the Carey School of Government at the University of Oxford. Prior to moving to Oxford this year, Lant spent 10 years as a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development and professor of the practice of international development at the Carey School of Government at Harvard University. Lant is a graduate of Brigham Young University. He did an undergraduate degree in economics, and at MIT with a PhD in economics. He joined the World Bank after graduating from MIT and worked at World Bank headquarters in Washington, as well as in the field in Indonesia and India. In the early 1990s, he served as an advisor to World Bank VP Larry Summers. And between 2000 and 2004, he took leave from the World Bank to serve as a lecturer at the Kennedy School, to which he returned in 2007. While at the World Bank, Lant participated as part of the team that produced many World Bank reports, including the World Development Report in both 1994 and 2004, and Assessing Aid, What Works, What Doesn't, and Why. Lant continues to circulate and publish criticisms of contemporary development in aid and development theory, such as random control trials, a topic that he and I discussed a year ago or so. In 2006, he published Let Their People Come, Breaking the Gridlock of Global Labor Mobility, one of the first major studies of what has become a major issue in political economy of the past decade and probably the coming decade as well, and that is labor migration. In 2013, Lant published The Rebirth of Education, subtitled Schooling Ain't Learning. His criticism of global education systems shares much with his criticism of global aid and development systems, which I suspect is why Oxford wanted him to come to direct their new Center on Improving Educational Systems. Please join me in welcoming to ASU one of the most insightful students of the economics of growth and development of our generation, Lant Pritchett.
Thank you very much. So as the introduction reveals, I'm an economist who doesn't respect one of the fundamental principles of economics, which is specialization. I am specialized in development economics, which is the economics of everything but the US, so hopefully no one will ask me any question about anything in the US. I'm going to talk about global poverty, place, productivity, or program today. But I've tried to be clear and succinct in what I want to say, and then leave plenty of time for questions. And in the question and answer, we can start from what I've presented today and broaden into anything you might want to ask a development economist. So lots of people talk, and they use the phrase like, solve global poverty, that global poverty is a problem to be solved. And then when they think, how are we going to solve global poverty, what follows the phrase solve global poverty is one of three things, although really two of them. One is, the assumption is the solution to global poverty is programs targeted at the poor. We, in some sense, governments, philanthropists, donors, are going to have programs, and I listed the array of things that get discussed under the rubric of solving global poverty, from microfinance to livelihood programs to transfers of livestock assets to job training to targeted scholarships. And just my rough guess is that absorbs about 80% of the public discourse. If you said, what follows the phrase solve global poverty, 80% of what would follow in a discourse about solving global poverty would be programmatic intervention. It would be discussions about what would work to solve global poverty. What programmatic interventions could we take? Broad-based economic growth, just living in an economy that kind of does okay, would absorb maybe, and this is always just wild-ass guesses, would absorb maybe 20%. People would recognize that actually living in a more prosperous economy leaves you less likely to be poor, and we probably worry about that some. And then reducing the restrictions on the mobility of low-skilled labor occupies generously 1% of the discourse. So if one says, I'm actually interested in solving global poverty, what I would like is that Europe and the US absorb 3 times or 4 times or 10 times as many migrants as they currently absorb, people look at you like you're a lunatic. I've had it happen to me many times because they wouldn't in their mind draw the connection between immigration and the reduction of global poverty. So I want to argue today that this allocation is exactly wrong. I never get really excited about being mildly wrong, but this is exactly wrong. This kind of allocation of discourse is exactly backwards. So this is kind of going to be 2 different themes are going to run through here. The first is that if you want to talk about reducing global poverty, the programmatic, all of what is said about every program is completely irrelevant. Doesn't make any difference in the large. All of it is growth. And when I say all of it, I don't mean most of it, I mean all of it. So basically, if you want to solve poverty, having broad-based growth is a necessary and sufficient condition, full stop. So that's the first point. So if you're not talking about broad-based growth, you're not really talking about reducing poverty to first order. Second, for a given level of income across countries, meaning if we say we are in an economy and we're doing all we can to promote broad-based growth, what else is there? For any given level of income, far and away, and by far and away I mean orders of magnitude, and I like to work on issues where the gaps are orders of magnitude because all the methodological differences kind of become relatively less important when you're talking about factors of 100. The most reliable and cost-effective means of reducing poverty is reducing the restrictions on the mobility of low-skilled labor. So, in fact, the biggest restriction on economic liberty in the world today is the fact that rich countries don't let other people come into their country and work. So, reducing that restriction, relaxing it even modestly, is far and away the largest thing the rich world could do to help global poverty. And so relative to 80%, 20%, 1%, I'm arguing that that allocation is exactly wrong, and it probably should be all we can here, and the only poverty program that really should be discussed is how we would reduce the barriers that restrict low-skilled workers from working in high-productivity places. So let me just, and I don't know, I'm sure the audience is a little mixed, so I'm going to go too slow for some and too fast for others, but I want to just get the basics out. What I mean by poverty and what most of the measures of poverty are is there's a distribution of consumption expenditures. Sometimes we call it income, but mostly in the data I'm talking about, it's consumption expenditures. And then we say there's a level of consumption expenditures below which one can't live an adequate lifestyle, and we'll call that level of expenditures a poverty line. And if you live in a household that has less than that level of expenditures, we say you're poor. And that's how you would calculate poverty, is you would just add up in some way the number or proportion of people below a certain threshold, and then you would do it in a variety of ways. Headcount poverty is just the total number of people below that line, or the percent of the population below that line. You could calculate a poverty gap, which is what's the magnitude? How far is this distribution below the line where this person is less poor than this person? So the gap is smaller for these people than these people. Or we could even do an intensity measure of poverty that weights how far you are below the poverty line by the square of this distance. Mostly what I'm going to say is about headcount poverty, because it's the simplest, clearest to understand, but I suspect nearly everything I said is certainly true of the gap poverty. The intensity numbers get a little more complicated. So if we have this understanding of poverty, which is there's a distribution of the consumption expenditures in a country, we're going to draw a line through this consumption expenditures distribution, we're going to calculate how many people are poor. That immediately reveals kind of three conceptual ways one could address poverty. The first is you could kink it up, which is you could say, let's go find the people or households that are below the poverty line, and one could imagine a transfer program where we said, this is how far you are from the poverty line, we'll add to your existing pre-tax transfer, pre-intervention income this amount, and we're going to try and deliberately push the bottom of this distribution up towards the poverty line. And and this creates a little kink in the distribution. If you were to accomplish this by pushing the distribution up, the post-intervention distribution in principle would look like this, kind of kinked around the poverty line. And I call it that because I call this approach generally kinky development, which tends to enhance interest in it, even though I'm against it. The second is you can imagine just the whole distribution shifting without changing inequality, without changing the bottom tail, without changing anything, just the exact same distribution shifts up. Everybody gets proportionately better off by the same proportionate amount. And this the after distribution is just higher than the before distribution. And you could see that that also changes poverty without any particular intervention in inequality or targeting of the poor or anything. And then the third is you just allow somebody to move from one country's distribution and become a worker and hence receive an income in another distribution, and you change the person's productivity by allowing them to work in a different place. So this is the structure of the talk. Program would be identify the poor, do something specifically for the poor that would raise their incomes. Productivity, by which I mean overall economy-wide shift in the distribution without worrying about its shape per se. And place, which is allowing people to change places they're working as a way of allowing them to change their income and hence consumption. So that's and kind of that's it, meaning those are kind of the three ways poverty can go down. If poverty is the fraction of people below this line, those are kind of the three ways you can do it, and everything that gets talked about can be lumped into one of those buckets. So now the core of the presentation is three empirical facts. And these three empirical facts kind of spin off into a variety of implications, and hopefully each of these empirical facts come with a super cool graph. I'm a very visually oriented person, so I like to explain it with a graph. And this is the kind of bulk of what I want to talk about. First, all of the differences in cross-national poverty turn out to be the shift of the distribution. And I'll show you what I mean in a minute. Second, the best gains that have been demonstrated from in-place targeted programs are small and they're costly to get. There just aren't supernormal returns available to in-place poverty programs. There's no magic bullet that basically the message is if you want to reduce poverty by $1, it's going to cost you $1. There's no bargains. And that kind of makes sense for reasons I'll get into. And then finally, the gains from low-skill mobility are massive. the gains, as we will see, the gains from the best implemented targeted programs in the world have impacts that can be calculated in terms of the gain from labor mobility. You would ask yourself the question, how many weeks would I have to let the person work in a rich country to produce the same income as the best anti-poverty program would produce in a lifetime? That's the difference in the magnitudes of these things. And then we get way more controversial, and roughly to the recipient countries, these gains are free. There's no cost to the recipient country of having more workers come work in the rich country, because what changes is workers are working in a low productivity place, and now they work in a high productivity place, and because they're working in a high productivity place, they have higher income without taking income away from anyone else. So to some extent, these gains, whereas these gains are costly to gain, these gains are free. And then we'll get back to all of the interesting stuff is after we accept all of this, then we ask ourselves, well, why aren't countries doing it, and why, in what way is it not free? Okay, so here's the first graph. And this is just a graph of, for all 389 country time periods for which the World Bank has a poverty number, from an actual household survey distribution. This is the association between the median annual consumption of the distribution. The median is the point, 50% of the distribution is below, 50% distribution is above. It's not the mean, and that turns out to be super important. So when I say broad-based growth, I mean changes in the median, the middle of the distribution. And so this is the middle of the distribution on which you're calculating the poverty rate. So I'm just looking at, let's take the distribution on which I'm calculating the poverty rate and say where its median is, versus the poverty rate at 3 different levels. This is extreme poverty. This is a less extreme poverty, and this is moderate poverty. And these are just poverty lines that the World Bank uses to create poverty, to create, if someone in Q&A wants to ask the question, why do I regard all these poverty lines as nonsense? You can ask that question, and I have a whole tirade about that. But this is what they do. So whenever you see any numbers about global poverty, this is what they are. So let's look at them and say what the association is. And this is the strongest statistical association you will ever see in your life. So all the time you're going to go to academic things and people will say, here's the association between this and that. Well, it turns out if we say, what's the correlation between the predicted value of poverty based on the median of your country's distribution? So all I know about your country is the median of the distribution of consumption. What's the correlation between that predicted value and your actual poverty rate? It's bounded mathematically between 0 and 1. The number is 0.994. Okay, if you ever took a statistics class, your jaw should be open. Like, you just don't actually see correlations of 0.994 in the real world. Like, people sell you R-squareds of 0.1 as being an important thing all the time. What this says is basically, if I tell you the country's median, you don't need to know anything else to predict its poverty amazingly accurately. That includes, by the way, and this is just that same graph, roughly, for just extreme poverty. So this is just the lower of the poverty lines. And in this graph, white space has meaning. Like when you see a graph with data in it, you usually focus on the dots. But white space has meaning. White space says, here are combinations that we never observe. Right? So if we have an association between median and poverty, we don't see anybody in all of this range. There is no country that is even moderately high median income that has a poverty rate above 10%. So if you get above 3,000 median, your poverty rate's below 10%. We have never observed a country in this space. And by the same token, there's nobody down here. In some sense, you can't be down here because in these cases, your median is actually often, your median is above the poverty line. So you can't transfer everybody gets it, if your median's above the poverty line, you can't transfer your way into lower poverty very well because everybody's poor. So there's nobody down here and there's nobody out here because everybody is pretty much, except in this range where there's a fair amount of variation. But basically, if you're very poor, you have very high poverty. If you're moderately prosperous, you have very low poverty. And it pretty much follows. There just aren't, it's just not the case that countries get high median consumption and still have poverty problems. And it's just not the case that people solve poverty at low levels of the median. So if you say, how am I going to solve global poverty? And the next time anyone mentions any program about global poverty to you, the number you should think is 0.994. 0.994 means all of the action is in the median. And what that means is I really don't need to know anything else about the country. I don't need to know what its policies are. I don't need to know whether it's democratic, whether it has a left ideology or a right ideology. I don't need to know anything about the existing anti-poverty programs, because all of the impact of the anti-poverty programs are a subset of the 1.2 to 1.7% that isn't explained by median. So conditional on the median, like you might think left ideology, right ideology matters for the median, but conditional on the median, it doesn't matter for poverty. Conditional on the median, policies don't matter for poverty. Conditional on the median, programs just don't matter for poverty. And there's somebody in the audience who's going to disagree with me because they know well one case where this isn't true, but the one case that isn't true, the few cases where it isn't true have to add up on average to be less than 1% of the variance. So there might be counterexamples to this within that, but overall, the relationship has to be true. So this is just, and I don't know whether you think I'm going on and on about this, but this is really super important because anybody who says the word solve global poverty and doesn't talk about broad-based economic productivity and prosperity just isn't talking about nearly all of the relevant phenomena. Now, so that's the first point I want to make. Second is the second is let's come back to programs and let's think about what kinds of gains we might be able to observe from programs. And let's think about it like an economist would think about it. And how an economist would think about it, or not let's us. I'm going to think about it how an economist thinks about it, and how an economist thinks about it is, before we ask, how would doing this or that change the well-being of this person or that person, I want to start from the assumption they're doing the best they can for themselves. Like, they're not just random atoms that things are happening to. They're people. They're making decisions. They're making choices. And I start with respecting that probably they're doing the best they can for themselves. And so I should start asking, how is what I'm going to do as an anti-poverty program going to improve their well-being, conditional on assuming they're already doing roughly the best they can for themselves? Well, if I assume that, then that kind of implies there shouldn't really be extraordinarily high return investments in what are private goods. So if I say, I'm going to undertake a program of giving people in Africa a pair of shoes whenever someone buys a pair of shoes, which is an anti-poverty program that's actually been implemented, we should ask, well, what's going to be the benefit to the person of a pair of shoes? We should probably expect it to be roughly the cost of a pair of shoes. Like, there shouldn't be some extraordinary impact of a pair of shoes, because the person could have chosen to use the resources to buy a pair of shoes. So their valuation of a pair of shoes should be roughly a pair of shoes. There's no extraordinary things. And yet, by the way, this gets ignored all the time because people assume that we can give the poor a productive asset, and that productive asset is somehow going to be transformational on their income. Well, maybe, but if the productive asset had an enormously potentially high return transformational thing, you have to ask yourself, why don't they own it already? Same thing with lots of other things like training. I'm going to give this person some training, and that's going to transform their life. Well, someone could have run a business of selling them that training. If that business of selling that training doesn't exist, you have to just ask yourself, why doesn't it already exist if it's got super high returns? So we should expect, in my view, that there aren't really extraordinarily high returns to trying to raise the income of the poor, in part because what the poor are doing is the best they can to raise their own incomes, because they would like to eat more food and they would like to have more shoes already. And so as a benchmark of what a private return, the historical real rate of return on US stocks is about 6%. So 6% is a high rate of return. So a 10% return that would come at the risk of the US market would be a fantastic return. So if I could raise people's income by 10%, I should be extraordinarily happy. That should be that kind of should be my upper bound of what I should expect from doing an anti-poverty program. Okay, so what are the gains from, and here I'm just building intuition before I show you. I'm going to get to actual empirical results, but I want to build your intuition of what the results should look like before I show them to you. So basically, a person at the global poverty line is about $2,770 annually. So a 10% gain is $277. So if I've done something and it's increased the income of a person at the poverty line by 10%, I've raised their income by $277. How much should I expect to pay in costs up front to generate $277 as a sustained return? Does everybody get where I'm going? Like, kind of what's the NPV of, and to an economist, that's sort of like asking, what's the net present value of $277? Right? If I'm going to give you an endowment where you're going to get $277, an annuity of $277 for life, what should that cost you in a fair market? It should cost you about $5,000. That's at a low return. At 10% discount rate, obviously, money in the future is worth less. So you would only, if you had a high discount rate, you would only pay $2,700 for a $277 a year annuity. So if we say what we're going to do with our poverty program is we're going to create sustained income, well, that's like an annuity. I'm going to create an incremental income stream for somebody. It's going to be like an annuity. What should I expect to pay for that annuity if markets work well? And the answer is you should expect to actually pay quite a bit, and it would depend on your discount rate. Same calculations done if we take the global low-skill wage, which is the global wage of a person with less than a high school degree. The annual wage of that person is about $4,740, so 10% of that would be $474. So if you could do something in terms of job training or skill enhancement or human capital creation that created a 10% increase in the wage of a low-skill worker, you should expect that to cost between $5,000 and $8,000. Is that clear? Because after all, if for $500 per worker, you could create a sustained stream of $500 a year, that would be a crazy high return investment, and everybody should be trying to do it, right? So we would expect those to have sometimes been competed away. So I'm going to show you the actual results from what is arguably and what its proponents claim is the currently best evidenced, best anti-poverty program in the world. So I'm not shooting fish in a barrel. I'm not creating a straw man. I'm saying, here is what advocates of anti-poverty programs claim is the best anti-poverty program, best meaning both it works and there's super rigorous, hardcore, randomized control evidence to show that it works, program that's been implemented in multiple settings. So we have multiple sites in which this has worked. It's been evaluated rigorously. And if you go to the website about this, they will say, we now know what works for poverty, give us money to do this. So for them, these are extraordinarily positive results. I say this because, again, I'm not picking on a weak customer here. This is like, they on their website, they sell this as the best program. Well, these are the, and this was a program that's called the graduation approach that's targeted at the ultra poor, who are usually rural households. It's a 8-component program, meaning it's a super sophisticated program because they do 8 separate things as part of the overall anti-poverty intervention. They transfer stocks of assets in the terms of livestock. They give business training in how to keep accounts. They provide a savings program. They provide health insurance and 4 other things I don't remember. So it's a complex, multi-component intervention that it takes to achieve these results. And roughly, these are the numbers of how much it costs, how much the annual benefit, so there's costs for the first 2 years as you do the program, and what they've done is evaluate year 3 income. So in Ethiopia, it cost $4,200 to generate $424 in income. Now you see why I was creating intuition, because this kind of looks like it should look, right? It kind of looks like, oh yeah, if I was going to generate a sustained income flow, I should have expected it to be pretty costly. And it turns out it is. So on average across, and by the way, the reason, again, this is famous is because they did a rigorous randomized controlled trial in which some people had this program as a treatment and other groups were followed who didn't have it, so we really know the with and without treatment income with some accuracy and that it's not self-selection. And they did almost exactly the same program in multiple settings, so we know this isn't just a once-off of a particularly dynamic individual who made it happen. This is a replicable program, can be replicated at least with the NGO that implements this, which is a very good NGO, very sophisticated. And they did it in 6 places. I'm only showing you 5 because in one of the 6 countries, the livestock asset that they transferred was chickens, and there was a chicken flu and it killed all the chickens, so the program had terrible returns, which again, you know, most businesses fail because something goes wrong. So it's not ridiculous that at least one of your settings, your program went south for some unforeseen thing. And I'm not even going to show you that one. In the 5 places where it roughly worked, they spent $4,500 to generate $344 in year 3 income. This is NPV at 5%. This is about $4,000. So if you said, what would I pay for this stream on the assumption this lasts forever? What would I pay for what would I pay if I had to pay $4,500 to get $344? Well, I'd actually pay $4,000 for that. Raise your hand if you like getting this. Good, okay, good. I mean, this is kind of complicated economics, but on the other hand, it's pretty straightforward too. It's like, you're gonna pay some money up front, you're gonna get a stream of return. How much would you pay for it? You all make calculations like this all the time when you check some box to have stuff deducted from your wages to be savings, right? So this is kind of the best you can do. And I'm kind of sympathetic to the advocates out there that are saying we should think of that, and we should think of cash as the index fund of anti-poverty programs. Meaning if you're going to say I'm going to give people shoes, you should be able to tell me why you shouldn't just give people cash and let them choose what to buy. Or if you say, I'm going to give people chickens and some business training in raising chickens, and I pick on chickens because Bill Gates has famously said chickens are the solution to poverty in Africa, which, depending on how you feel about software, I could either say he knows about software but doesn't know about poverty, or I could say he doesn't know either, depending on how you feel about Microsoft. People have advocated chickens, but you have to think, well, wait a second, instead of giving them chickens and business training and use them chickens, just give them the cash that it would have taken you to do all of that. So instead of paying somebody to train someone, take the cash you would have paid to train someone and give them cash. And unless you can tell me that what you're doing is better than cash, why are you doing it? Why are you doing all the rigmarole of training in chickens unless it's better than cash? So cash is kind of the index fund. Most anti-poverty programs don't outperform cash. So most of what is done under the rubric of anti-poverty programs doesn't meet the cash as an index fund constraint. You really would have been, because often they incur super high costs and don't produce higher than cash returns. Then even the best programs like the graduation program I've just shown you, it has a 7% rate of return. 7%'s like okay. It's like, if you invested your money in stocks, you should expect 6. So 7's not terrible. But 7 isn't super normal either, right? 7 is kind of if you had given people cash and they invested the cash in their own domestic stock market, they could probably make about 7. So 7 doesn't dominate cash very much. And what all of this means is if you are donating money towards anti-poverty programs, you should expect $1's worth of income gain to a poor person to cost you $1. And anyone who says, you can transform a person's life with $1 is mostly just lying. Well, they mean one of two things, one of which is perfectly legitimate, and I'll show you a graph in a minute, and the other is they're just making stuff up, right? Because after all, if you say you can transform a person's life with $1, you got to ask yourself, why didn't they do it? Right? If their life could have been transformed for $1, why didn't they spend $1 and do whatever magic it was you were talking about? Now, they also could be talking about the fact that there's declining marginal utility of income, and even with modest declining marginal utility of income, this is just a map of consumption per day. This is a typical poverty line. Logarithmic utility means marginal utility goes up as 1 over the level of consumption. That's a nonlinear thing. So poor people have super high marginal utility. So if I take one of my dollars, which I spend out here somewhere, I won't say how far out, but most of us in the audience are out here, and transfer it to a person who has this marginal utility terms, it has enormous impacts. So I'm not saying that transfers from rich people to poor people are a bad idea. They're a terrific idea in marginal utility terms, but it's $1's worth of consumption buying more than $1's worth of utility. It's not $1's worth of consumption by some magic buying more than $1's worth of consumption. And that's just really super important. Okay. Now, so that's the second point. And again, that's kind of, I'm not trying to be negative, but I'm trying to be realistic. So first is, it's all growth. Second, part of the reason it's all growth is that poverty programs are just expensive. And we should expect them to be expensive with a fundamental economic view of the world. Then third, the place we get true, the least you can do for the global poor is way better than the best you can do. So the best you can do in a programmatic sense is $1 creates $1. But the least you can do is way better than that. And what's the least you could do? Well, the least you could do is just stop having people, stop them from engaging in the economic transaction of working in your country. Rich countries are deploying active coercion to prevent people from working in their countries. And if you just stopped doing that, or relaxed how many people you're stopping from doing that, that would be way better than anything else you could do. And so what we've calculated with co-authors of mine is what I call the price equivalent of border-based restrictions on labor. So if you think, I'm a country, I impose a tariff, and I say I'm going to have a tariff of 25%, then the rest of the world is willing to sell your country something for $1, but it's going to cost you $1.25. That's the tariff impact of restricting trade. And Doug Irwin was here, and anybody who heard Doug Irwin probably understands this much better than you did before, and maybe better than I do. But then we can say, well, what if we don't have quota? What if we don't have tariffs, we have quotas? What if we just say, we're not going to put a tariff on sugar, we're just going to only allow a certain tons of sugar to come into the market? So it's not obvious what the price equivalent is. Well, trade economists can calculate the price equivalent because they can say, what's the price of sugar in a port in the Caribbean? What's the price of sugar with the quota in the US? What's the transport cost? And the comparison between the domestic price of sugar and the landed cost of sugar is the price equivalent of the tariff, of the quota. Does everybody get that? Good, because that's the easy part. That's just an analogy with what we do with labor. The US has a very complex and opaque system of restrictions of who can come and be in our country for what reasons and what kind of work they can do. And that creates a gap between low-skilled labor that would like to come to the US and low-skilled labor wage in the US. And how big is that gap? Well, we've answered that question. And here's the answer. Well, let's come back to that, because that's just the cool graph. And the answer is $17,000 a year. So if we take a typical person, by which we're just going to say, let's just ask what the earnings of an otherwise observational equivalent person are working in their home market and working in the US market, and then we'll adjust for the fact for selectivity, and then that's the gain that that person would have if they worked in the US market versus their home market. The average of that number across 40 countries in the world is $17,000. Now you remember, if their wages go up 10%, it goes up by $470. Whereas just moving from the place they are, nothing better about them, nothing improved about them, no training, no human capital augmentation, just moving from a low productivity to a high productivity place, their income goes up $17,000 a year. Which is just, and remember, the best poverty program, you spend $4,500, you get $344 a year. So this is what I mean about orders of magnitude. I like orders of magnitude, because whatever methodological quibbles you might have about this, and we've spent years refining this so we can answer every quibble you might have, maybe it's 15 and not 17, but it's not 340, right? Now, and by the way, this is just the cool graph. This is roughly the supply curve. This is the wages of the equivalent labor weighted by population. So roughly, this is the, if we think of the price equivalent as being the difference between what the world would supply us sugar and what sugar costs in the US, this is the world supply curve of labor versus what the labor makes in the US, right? And there's roughly, at the level of 17,000, there's roughly 1 billion 15 to 49 years old in the world who exist on the part of the global supply of labor, of low-skilled labor, where the difference is $17,000. So we're not talking about $17,000 for a few people in a few poor places. There's 1 billion people on the planet whose incomes would go up by $17,000 if they were allowed to work in the United States. And these are low-skilled people. These are people who would come and do low-skill occupations. So you can see where, now if we come back, I don't know if you noticed the purple bar before, but this is the annual gain from the best program in the world. This is the annual gain for those same countries with the calculations of how much more low-skilled people would make if they worked in the US. So this isn't quite 2 orders of magnitude, but 344, 1 order of magnitude, a factor 10 larger would be $3,000. So it's sort of a factor of 40 larger to let a low-skilled worker work in the United States for a year than try and augment their income in their own country in the best way you can possibly do it for a year. And the reason this exists is that rich countries are just high productivity places. They're just high productivity places to work. And they're high productivity in a way that's in the air. They're high productivity because they're high productivity. And hence, this is a guy at the top of the Himalayas. There's just not enough air to be productive. And if this guy gets down off the mountain and comes to sea level, he's enormously more productive because he has more air. But by coming down to sea level, everybody at sea level has the same amount of air. He doesn't take away from anybody's air by being at sea level. So his productivity goes up by having more air. Nobody else has any less air. What economists have learned over time is that most of the productivity differential across countries is in A. And I don't know why we call it A, but it happens to have the same letter as air. So most of the productivity differential across countries is accounted for by something that is in the air in the country. It's just a more productive place for all factors to be used, both labor, high-skilled labor, and capital. And hence, when you allow a person to come from a low productivity place to a high productivity place, their productivity goes up. But their productivity goes up because there's productivity in the air, so there's no reason to believe that incremental productivity takes anything away from the person in the country where productivity is already high. Which means it's an arbitrage opportunity. It's a free gain to income. It doesn't cost anybody anything because the reason their income is higher is because they are more productive and people are willing to pay them that wage. There's no transfer, there's no charity, it's just you allow people to work at the wage people are willing to pay. Now, why isn't this on the agenda? Why is only 1% of the world's discourse about poverty? Why does everybody talk about giving people shoes and nobody talks about letting them work in the United States? And I only have one bullet because rich country voters hate it. Like, that's it. There's nothing else. I don't need 3 reasons. There's one reason. Rich country voters hate it. They hate talking about it. They hate doing it. They don't want to do it. And since they don't want to do it in their rich countries, they can block it being discussed in international organizations. They can block it being on the agenda. Since it's politically impossible, nobody wants to talk about it. So people just don't talk about it. But they don't talk about it, not because it's not what I've just said isn't true, but because in spite of being true that it would be enormously beneficial, rich country voters just aren't going to do it. Now, I think I'm running overtime. So let me just, I'm going to say one more controversial thing and then take questions. Now, if we think about the ways in which people move across borders, we kind of have different modalities by which people migrate. One is we might have a high-skill intended citizenship path kind of mobility, that the rich world goes out and takes doctors and PhDs and employs them at universities. Another is a low-skill citizenship path. Another is a low-skill rotational path, which is rich countries allow poor country workers to work in their country for a limited amount of time and then insist that they go home. And then there's refugee or asylum kind of mobility. And each of those 4 has a different pattern of benefits and risks as perceived by rich country voters. And I break those risks into sort of economic risks to natives, security risks, political risks, way of life risks, and morality risks. And kind of my fundamental claim is that a lot of the discourse is about economic risks to natives of allowing more workers to come in the country. And roughly that's complete, total bullshit. It's basically, to the extent there is an economic science, we agree on this one thing, that low-skill mobility to rich countries in a flexible labor market has 0 impact on average wages, has 0 impact on low-skill wages, and probably has 0 impact even on super low-skill wages, because we've had lots of data, lots of studies, lots of things. I can show you some, but I'm running behind. Then secondly, the idea that migrants have fiscal costs is, again, it's just an illusion, because if we had a program to allow more workers to come, the fiscal costs are a design feature, not a fact. And I can, meaning if we say, oh, if we allow a worker to come, they'll incur these costs. Well, if you design it that way, but you could design it in another way such they're not entitled to those, and then the fiscal costs would be completely different. So when people talk about the fiscal costs of migration, they're mostly talking that. Let me skip this because let me skip this because we'll come back to. So fundamentally, the reason we don't have development-friendly, low-skill rotational labor mobility is rich country voters don't like it, and the real concerns are way-of-life concerns. And by way-of-life concerns, it means people we just don't like other people. And we like us and we don't like them. And when we say, how about more of them benefit by coming to work near us? People go, no, we don't want that. But any talk about it being wages or fiscal costs is really just a mask for, we just don't like those kind of people near us in our country, and we're not going to have it in spite of the benefits. And until we go to that heart of the issue, we're really not talking about what the real issues are. And then the real trick is balancing these way-of-life costs with morality costs. So let me stop there, because I think I've said at least 5 super controversial things. And so there should be plenty of time for questions. And plus, Ross has stood up in a way that indicated. So, Lant, why don't you start talking?
I'd like to start questions from students first.
Okay.
So are there students? Christoph, you'll eventually.
And let me just say in advance, I actually am hard of hearing. So if I don't hear you and say, what did you say? It's not a game. It's like I'm hard of hearing.
Okay. I just want to say thank you for the talk. I just have one quick question. When it comes to, can you hear me well?
Sure.
Okay. When it comes to the World Bank's measure of poverty, how accurate or precise or useful is their measure of, like, because they just use a blank. I think the measure of poverty is $1.90, under $1.90. How accurate or useful is that when it comes to, like, in the United States, when it comes to different tax laws of California, it's a lot more expensive to live than it is in the Midwestern states. So how useful is their studies on that? And my second question is, if we're just kind of relying on global poverty to be reduced by letting low income workers come into the United States, how does that affect or make it more how does that help domestically with other countries? So if we have people coming from the southern borders, how does that help the southern countries increase GDP or?
Okay, good. Should I take one at a time or should we? Okay, so first answer is the poverty rates are accurate enough. Dozens and dozens of super smart economists have spent 30 years addressing the question of, does a dollar here really mean a dollar there in terms of purchasing power? And there's been decades of studies on purchasing power parity, so they're not doing it in a stupid way, they're doing it in a super sophisticated way that tries to say, what does a shirt cost in India versus a shirt in California versus a shirt in Europe versus a shirt in Africa, and then create something called purchasing power parity, where we're comparing actual command over the same bundle. So there might be problems with the dollar a day line, but that's not one of them. We do relatively accurately measure kind of differential living standards on a reasonably comparable basis, because there's been, again, the ICP project has been since the 1970s. So economists have been working on that question since before you were born. You look young, maybe before your mother was born. So we kind of have a handle on it. That's not a huge problem. I mean, it's a huge conceptual problem, but people have been working on it for 40 years and have it roughly in hand. There are kind of exceptions at the margin, but mostly true. Second question is, let me go back to these kinds of things. I think there's two different, so here we're talking about letting people come and do low-skill work on a rotational basis. I would think this would mostly be good for the societies in which they come from, And there's pretty good evidence of that because A, if you come on a rotational basis, you save a lot of what you do and you go back to your home country with savings. B, if you're on a rotational basis, you're not going back home, you remit a lot of money back to people back home and people educate their children with that money and do other investment things with that money. So the reason I call this kind of labor mobility development friendly is that it's good for the person who moves and good for the place they come from because they expect to go back there. This is an open question. If what Australia does is say, I know what we'll do, we'll have a points system where I'll decide who is the person that's going to contribute most to Australia and then allow them to come to Australia. Well, not surprisingly, who's going to contribute most to Australia would have contributed a ton to Thailand had they stayed in Thailand. So this column has a lot more dubious developmental impacts, which is why I'm only talking about this column when I say super good for poverty. Does that make sense? And I think this, and the problem is, this is far and away the most politically popular. So if you say to rich countries, of these four, what do you want? Oh, doctors, great. Doctors from Vietnam, will take doctors from Vietnam. If you say, how about, some people from Honduras to come check you out at Home Depot, no, we'll have automated checkout. Thank you very much. Yeah. This girl's woman, sorry. She's really anxious. We'll get to you, though. So.
Thank you for this fascinating talk. Do you mind going back to the slide where you compared the $17,000 to the $344?
Yeah.
So I have a question on that.
Yeah. This one. Yeah.
Yes. So I was wondering, have you considered maybe standardizing your measures, right? So generally speaking, what I'm thinking here, so I'm from Zimbabwe, right? So
from where?
Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe, okay.
Zimbabwe, right? So I'm thinking somebody who's making $20,000 of income in the United States and somebody making $5,000 in Zimbabwe. I suspect the $5,000 person in Zimbabwe would be more comfortable than the $20,000 here. So I was wondering if it would be possible to standardize.
Yeah, sorry. I should have said this at some point. They are standardized already in exactly the answer to his question. So all of the numbers I present are PPP adjusted.
Okay.
So I've adjusted for the fact it's enormously cheaper to live in poor countries because labor's cheaper. And all of the numbers I've shown you are already adjusted for that.
Okay, wow.
So if I don't adjust them, these numbers are 4 times as big. So meaning this gain is adjusted on the assumption that you're spending all your income in the US. But if you come to the US, make the US wage, and go back to Zimbabwe, then this number is actually about 3.5 times bigger. So I've already super understated my case by adjusting for purchasing power that it's cheaper to live in poor countries. So everything I'm saying is adjusted assuming that you still have to spend the wage at the high country prices. So yeah, person at 5,000, I mean, you're exactly right. 5,000 money income and 20,000 money income is about the same, but which is why we've scaled for actual purchasing power. Sorry.
So we really discuss a very interesting topic. And me personally, I'm from Ukraine,
Okay.
you know? So I had a chance to live in a few countries. And I've been asking this question to many people in different countries. What do you think about immigrants coming to your country?
Okay.
I've asked that Germans, for example, Italians, and now in the US, you know?
Right.
And at first, everyone is very polite. People give a very right kind of answers, right? We want to hear, because that's what we're taught.
Right.
But if you dig deeper, you get totally different kind of answers. That's the answers, what people really think. And, you know, I do not believe in such a big difference between people in Africa or like America or Ukraine. We are basically the same. We have this instinct to protect our territory. And probably I should think otherwise, because I'm actually like a temporary immigrant, right? But the thing is, I do understand why people don't want immigrants coming to their country. First of all, because the difference is very hard to adjust. If you come from the country where you have no shoes and you live here and you have like not only shoes but more privileges, you don't want to leave. You prefer to stay here, even if you work illegally.
Yep.
First of all, and second of all, you know, people are ready to work harder. And if first generation of immigrants
Absolutely.
has this bad kind of low kind of job, second generation will probably even do better than your kids, just because people are taught to work really, really hard. And you know what? I think that's what this generation, these voters, are kind of aware of, and they are scared of that. It's not a bad thing. As I was saying, I believe it's a human nature to protect the territory we live in.
So you're saying the current generation of American kids is lazy, and parents don't want their lazy kids to have to compete with hardworking immigrants? I'm just clarifying what
I
you're
would
saying.
put it otherwise. I would put it otherwise. But just so you'd understand, comparison, when I came here, I do enjoy my lifestyle here. I'd like to live this way in every country
Right.
I've been to, you know?
Right.
I work, well, you know? That's
Right.
the difference. For example, how funny it is, but like in poor countries, people work more.
Right.
You know, so basically what you said has some kind of a truth in it. So to sum up,
Yeah.
what you said is 100% beneficial, like for me, you know. I do believe
Right.
it's a right position, yes? But in the same time, what I think is it's kind of not fair to let people, maybe I'll sound a bit rude, not very polite, but sorry, but that's what I think. I think that like if
I mean, less polite than calling that little girl back there lazy?
not that little girl. I was just saying. I
Anyway.
mean, like I'm trying to say is
Yeah.
at some point I understand why America kind of does not allow everyone to get
Right.
into their country. By the way, I had a very tough interview at the embassy. I didn't like this interview. I don't like going to the U.S. embassy in general. It's a very bad place, with a very bad atmosphere.
Yeah.
But as I was saying, I think that if people protect their territory, it has some kind of truth in it, you know. And I understand this politics.
And again, so do I. And I think you're raising all of the difficult issues that need to be on the table but usually aren't. Yes, right? And these are what I call political risks, right? And way of life risks, right? Meaning Americans like their way of life, and not surprisingly, it's really groovy, right? And we happen to be dumb luck born into it. And if we think that's threatened by, letting other people enjoy it, we'll block it, and we do, right? So I understand that these are important, powerful forces. Here is, and what I'm saying is much more radical than I have led on so far. Because what I'm saying is, part of the issue is that most rich countries do not separate out two questions. One question is, who are the future citizens who will control the sovereign power in my country? And the second question is, who will I allow to work in my country? And most rich countries force those answers to be the same. And if you force those answers to be the same, then you say, look, I really would like more low-skilled labor in my country, but I actually don't want to put the future of my country in the democratic hands of people who I don't necessarily share affinities with. Which is why I want to say, let's separate out those two questions, and let's say we are going to allow people to come and work in our country under no assumption that they will ever become citizens. It's easy to control that. What? No, it's meaning all kinds of countries in the world control that perfectly possibly. It's that if you decide to control that, you can control that. It's a myth that you can't control that. Like all the Gulf states, they have no problem with rotational mobility. And a scheme, and by the way, we were making, a scheme in which labor brokers control the rotational mobility can easily enforce return. The trick is, can we enforce return without abusing the workers? And that's a hard question, right? But it's a myth that you can't make people return. You can make people return. So that's what I'm saying. I'm actually saying something radical, which is, let's stop assuming that all migration is, so I'm not making the claim people should be allowed to change their claims on citizenship. That's a question that each state has to decide for themselves, but conditional on how many people you will allow to be a citizen, you could easily allow 3 times, 4 times, 5 times as many people to work in your country as you're currently allowing to work in your country, on a way that doesn't assume that you're not putting your political future at the hands of your labor market. Does that make it clear? And this is precisely to say this is the balance between the concerns that we could actually have enormous gains for the movers from being able to move against the fact that for a variety of political reasons, people just don't want the future of their country in the hostage of what the labor market needs. Which, by the way, let me show one slide that I didn't show, and this is cheating to do this in Q&A. But if you look at where, according to the United States Department of Labor forecast, if we break workers into low skill and high skill, and kind of stuff that can maybe be pushed abroad and stuff that can't be pushed abroad, there's 3.6 million low skill can't be pushed abroad jobs that'll be created in the next 10 years. There's only 1.7 million additional Americans. So having people come to do these jobs doesn't take jobs away. And by the way, high skill jobs that can't be pushed abroad are exactly the number of net new labor market entrants of domestics. So no one is going to really care from an economic point of view that their child isn't being allowed to work in these industries because you're having immigrants do it. Because what we're really doing is displacing those with machines, not with domestic workers. Let's.
All right, so to me, though, while it makes sense that this would improve the welfare of individuals migrating, how does this really impact the poverty of the countries? You source places like
countries don't
India
have poverty, people have poverty.
and Ethiopia, yes, but of course it's a matter of, one can understandably take in a few thousand, but at the same time, immigration does naturally put immense and massive strains. You see this in the case of Europe, which is undergoing massive strain after taking in millions of migrants over the course of the refugee crisis. It's put its political and social institutions into crisis in many countries and is eroding the fabrics. It's catastrophic. And once again, it might improve the individuals. It still is a matter of it's the TFP that must be improved. So how does this remedy these broader issues? Because how can you uplift the collective masses from the poverty in their home countries?
So you heard the first part of the presentation, right? Yes. First part of the presentation is productivity in the home country has to go up to solve poverty. Great. And then I said, suppose we're doing everything we can on that front. We're doing everything we can to have Ethiopia have a high-performing economy. Then what else do we do at the margin? Do we do in situ programs, or do we, at the margin, allow more migrants? Right? So I'm super with you. Nobody's saying, oh, don't worry about global poverty, let them all come to the US. That would be an unfair caricature of what I just said. I said, let's have rapid economic growth as fast as we can make it, for as long as we can make it in the poor countries, and that will solve poverty, and that's the only thing that will solve poverty. Then, within that, what at the margin is the most beneficial thing you could do for individual poor people? It's allow them to come work in these countries at the margin. Nobody's used the word open borders. I have used the word relaxation of the restrictions, right? Third, you have Europe exactly backwards. Europe has an integration problem. They don't have an emigration problem. Europe needs 6 million people a year to work in their countries, or their economies are going to collapse under their own weight in the next 30 years. So the problem with Europe is not that they have too many people coming in. The problem with Europe is that they haven't accommodated themselves to deal with how to get the workers they need working in Europe. But the idea that Europe is under strain from too many workers has it exactly wrong.
Hey, I've really enjoyed your presentation so far. I know one of the reasons why U.S. labor is so highly valued is because of our labor standards, like federal minimum wage laws and other stuff.
No.
Really?
No.
Okay.
Federal minimum wage is like $7.25. the average unskilled worker in our sample from a developing country makes $10.30 an hour. So minimum wage has nothing to do with it.
I guess I was asking, how
It's-
does U.S.
what?
labor law impact the flexibility of the job market in the U.S.? And
Yeah,
how might
it
this
affects the
impact
flexibility of the job
immigration?
market, but minimum wage is an inflexibility of the labor market. And the problem is when the minimum wage is binding, then this becomes problematic because you're not sure wages reflect productivity. But in the US, since the minimum wage is so low and the labor market is so flexible, we know that the wage the workers are making actually reflects their productivity. So the workers are making the money because someone's willingly paying them the money because they actually have that productivity. So at that, having an additional worker work, it's win because the employer wants them to work because their contribution to productivity equals their wage.
Okay, thank you. That's my understanding.
Is that I'm sometimes accused of being too aggressive. I don't know why, but it's just like in other markets that's true. In Europe, they have much more of this problem because they have very high wages and they distort their labor markets more. So there you worry that the problem is the wage isn't reflecting productivity. But in the US, for good or ill, we don't intervene in labor markets enough so that these gains to foreigners aren't that they're taking advantage of artificially high wages, it's that they're taking advantage of being more productive in a productive place.
Hi, so I'm a sustainability and geography major, and so I was wondering, so climate change it affects people in low-income areas and poverty levels a lot more than people in lower-income areas.
Yeah.
So I was wondering what you think is the best way to address the issue of increasing poverty because of climate change. Third world nations are feeling the consequences of climate change a lot more than first world nations, but they're not the ones who are the largest emitters of greenhouse gases. So do you think it's incumbent upon the first world nations to go into these third world countries to foster renewable energy or practices that help the environment, or would that go against it?
I don't know anything about that. I don't have any sentences in my repertoire that have climate change in them, so I just don't know anything about it. I mean, and by the way, none of the poverty we observe today is because of climate change. So it's like, I'm not saying it's an unimportant topic, it's just I don't have any expertise. Like, if I use the word climate change in a sentence, I would be beyond my expertise. So I'm just not going to.
Thank you for the talk. How are you accounting for the impact of all this mobility of people coming to developed countries? The impact that has that we're comparing to the average possible income that they have in the normal conditions. But if they all move here, there will be more pressure on that average here in the local market in the developed country, and also will be probably an impact on the consumption in those markets, developing countries, and therefore the sales of the whole system are not going to be the same. Therefore, it's going to be less productivity also in the local market, in the developed country. So how are we accounting for all these effects if that mobility happens?
So this is the key question, right? The key question is the greater productivity of workers in America a public good or a private good? Private good is an apple, it's rival, it's excludable. If I eat the apple, you can't eat the apple. A public good is non-rival, non-excludable, everybody can enjoy it, right? My argument is nearly all the additional productivity of workers who move to the US is a public good. It's because the US is a high productivity economy and that high productivity is in the air. So it doesn't have any productivity reducing effects on anyone in the US to have an additional worker work in the US. B, because the worker works at high productivity, they spend that money in the local economy and so augment the local economy. So all of the best studies show the wages of the workers in the developed countries with flexible labor markets who receive more foreigners, wages don't go down. They just don't go down. So I'm taking into account by how much wages go down, but that amount is zero. So I'm not taking into account, I'm empirically taking it into account. It's just empirically it's zero. And I have a slide here that I didn't show. Again, I'm cheating. You know, we have lots of studies, a fair number of studies that show what happens when there's more migrants come. In the United States, we had a rotational mobility scheme that allowed workers to come work in agricultural labor from Mexico called Bracero. We eliminated Bracero, which did this to the employment of Mexican workers, again, officially through this program. And these are the with and without of Bracero states where there were Bracero workers versus states where there weren't Bracero workers. And these are wages in states without Bracero workers, and these are wages in workers where there were Bracero workers, and these are wages in states where there weren't Bracero workers. And so if you just look at the diffs in diffs, meaning did states who lost the Bracero workers, did their wages suddenly go up by more than states who didn't lose Bracero workers? And the answer is no, not at all. Exactly the same evolution of wages. So getting rid of an additional 20,000 agriculture workers a year had zero benefits for domestic workers. So we can show it in the negative, and we can show it in the positive. We can show when more workers come, wages won't go down. We can show it when workers are not allowed to come, wages don't go up. So it's just zero. It's not I'm ignoring it, it's zero.
So thank you for a very, very interesting lecture. First, maybe I would like to ask something about regarding the previous question. You've said about the correlation, but do you have any explanation for why importing more low-skilled workers doesn't decrease even super low-skill wages? And my second question will be regarding the risks associated with immigration. And there was this table of you've shown earlier.
I'm trying to get to it.
Yeah, the blue one. And there were some kinds of risks that could be avoided.
Can someone
risks
come help me with
that
the machine? I've lost control of the machine.
okay,
So,
some risks that weren't that important, or like economic risks that wasn't really real.
Right.
But we have risks like the political risk
Yeah.
and the security risk.
Absolutely.
So your recommendation for a model of
Can you move it?
low
Move it to the
skill
table.
labor
There's a table with
that could
risks.
reduce those risks would be
Yeah.
low skill rotational without citizenship, without election rights,
Yep.
and without probably also social benefits.
Yep.
And
Or I don't know. We can decide, but yeah.
because this would eliminate the fiscal.
Exactly. Or it would
costs.
modify the fiscal. But okay.
What else? What else would you add to this model for this to be your recommendation? For example, on the security risks.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
So again, the first thing is that, just coming back to it, the reason more workers don't reduce the wages of existing workers is they come, they work at higher productivity, they spend their money in the local economy on things that are produced by other low-skilled workers. B, mostly at the bottom end, what's been happening in the modern economy is super low-skilled workers are out of the labor force for other reasons, and or B, they're being displaced by capital. So when labor shows up willing to work at the going wage, employment actually expands. So there's a whole variety of industries in the United States that are willing to expand employment and just can't find workers to do it. So when low-skilled workers come from other countries willing to do it, employment in those industries expand. And it doesn't take away, because in some sense, the output of the industry was being constrained by the lack of available labor. So I think there are lots of reasons to understand why, with their high productivity, with it's a general equilibrium effect. If I come and I work, I spend money in the local economy, including on things produced by other low-skilled workers. And C, I think a lot of firms are at their binding constraint is being able to hire workers, and so output expands when they have available workers. And the main study of this is the Mariel boat lift in 1980. Castro allowed people to all of a sudden come from Cuba. They all went to Miami. It was 37% increase in the stock of super low-skilled workers in Miami. Zero impact on employment, on wages of anybody. So again, it's just an empirical fact. Okay, now when we go to this, we have to. My point is, I can create a program that addresses these risks. So for instance, I'm not saying security isn't a risk. Obviously, you can't just say, I want anybody in my country, including people that have expressed intent to do harm to my citizens. Of course, you have to regulate security risks. But what I'm saying is if you set about to design a low-skill rotational scheme, it's relatively easy to do so in a way that addresses adequately the security risks, right? Second, the fiscal, and let me just say, I'm aware that what I'm saying is hard. What I'm saying is hard because the world is hard. The world is a spectacularly, enormously unjust place. And it's a spectacularly, enormously unjust place because I happen to be born in the Intermountain West, and other people happen to be born in unproductive places, and that creates just an enormous gap in our lifetime expected material well-being. That for no good reason. It's not like I'm prosperous because I did anything. I just got born in a high productivity place. That's the fundamental injustice in the world. That fundamental injustice is made worse by the fact that I've decided to not let anybody else share in my prosperity by coming here, right? Then if we say, by the way, I'll let you come, but I'm not going to entitle you to all the benefits that I'm politically entitled to, that seems unfair. But what's really unfair is using a guard at the border to stop them from coming. And if we could say, look, we'll let 1 million more people come work in our country if we say you have to buy into health insurance or else we're not going to give you the full entitlement to health insurance, that seems like, oh my God, that's so unfair, we can't not give them health insurance. Well, yeah, but they're no better like not having health insurance, raising goats in Nepal than they are not having full entitlement to the full entitlement that a European or the US has to health insurance by virtue of being born there. So this is a hard thing to get at because people will say, no matter what you say about migration, people will say that's unfair. And it's right, it is unfair. The world's unfair, and the world's unfair because we have borders. Now, given that we have borders and the world's unfair, can we modestly reduce the unfairness by having rotational schemes that protect human rights but don't automatically entitle you to everything the native citizens are entitled to just by pitching up? Maybe. That's my claim, but it's a difficult claim to get political acceptance for because people on the right wing don't want them there anyway, and people on the left wing will claim it's unfair to let them come unless they're fully entitled. So the coalition is nobody comes. Because the left says they can't come unless they're entitled to everything. The right says I don't want them here anyway, and if they're entitled to everything, they don't pay for their way, so nobody comes. I'm trying to propose, hey, why don't we say, under what terms would we actually allow the workers who we actually need in the economy to come and be here? And those terms aren't going to be that everybody gets to be a US citizen and aren't going to be the terms that everybody's entitled to all the benefits US citizens are entitled to by the sheer dumb, stupid luck of having been born here. But the world is an unfair place. I'm just trying to make it modestly less unfair in an unfair way. Yeah.
So I work in the area of immigration and international trade. So I want you to know that I am fully sympathetic to the argument you're making. And in fact, I would argue I'd like to get rid of nation states as a whole and not have any borders. But aside from that, what does concern me though are the distributional impacts. And you mentioned the Muriel boat lift people, but it's the low skill here, the natives. They are impacted, and even in that case, rents went up. The existing natives were. There's paper by I think Card. They were pushed out, and they moved out of the regions. I think so. so here's my question. Since I am,
okay.
Maybe I'm
Yeah.
wrong about those, but
Right.
what would you do during the transition period to ameliorate the impact on the low skill? And how long would this period take of this transition?
I'm worried that I haven't said enough controversial things. So I'm going to say something controversial, right? I find that most people who, wow. Can we stop taping it just for a second? Okay. No, I'm kidding. That would be even worse, because then like people on the internet are like, oh my God, somebody must have videotaped that. Most people who deploy, I find that this argument is mostly completely bullshit and insincere, because most people who make the argument that we don't want more migration because it will not benefit the low-skilled in America don't otherwise give a shit about the low-skilled in America. Like, if you had somebody out there doing everything they could in terms of American public policy to make our own disadvantaged better off, and they were against migration, I'd take them seriously. But when somebody who doesn't otherwise evince any concern for the low-skilled and disadvantaged in America uses that as an argument to block immigrants from coming, it's just cynical bullshit. So first of all, most of it's cynical bullshit. No, that don't apply to place to you, but I want to get that out on the table because I think the discourse has been way dominated by a pretense that there are real economic risks to natives and that those need to be addressed, and that's the political binding constraint to more migration. And I think that's just false. I think it's way of life concerns and political concerns, and we need to talk about those in an honest and sincere way. Now, that said, second.
But I don't worry about those.
What? You don't worry about what?
I don't worry about those. I am worried about the distributional impact on low-skill population.
Second.
Hispanics in low-skill professions. I am worried about those.
Second.
I'm not worried about those other issues.
Okay, but I'm saying politically, people are getting a lot of traction with that argument when it's completely insincere and completely cynical, because the same people that supposedly are all of a sudden concerned about the low-skilled African Americans in Miami aren't otherwise concerned about any issue about low-skilled African Americans. So I think I want to call that out, not on you, but in the general political discourse, this shouldn't be allowed to have traction, right? B, I have a blog that you can go read. The adjustment costs for the super low skilled of the type that might have been affected by the Mariel boat lift are so unbelievably trivial. Like, I calculated the billions of dollars it would have taken to restore, even at the ridiculous level that Borjas claims they were affected. It's a trivial amount in terms of overall what we spend on social spending. So a tiny little increase in social spending could fully accommodate any magnitude of an incremental low-skilled migration I'm talking about. Because after all, we have the earned income tax credit. Right? The earned income tax credit affects the wage, the effective wage of the low-skilled. We could adjust the we could do anything we wanted with the earned income tax credit to compensate the low-skilled who were impacted. And like I say, I've done the calculations, and it's just a trivial number. It's like $32 billion to fully accommodate a nationwide impact of a Mariel boat lift wide nationwide. $32 billion in the grand scheme of the federal budget of $6 trillion, it's just nothing. Third, let me make one even more controversial thing that I can't prove because it might not be right. Most everything I've said is just completely, totally, absolutely right, but this might not be. Which is, the real problem for the low-skilled in America is that they're being displaced by machines. And here's an argument everybody understands. And I'm going to use the word climate change in spite of the fact I claimed I would never use it. Everybody understands we need a carbon tax. Why do we need a carbon tax? Because we need a carbon tax so that people will incorporate into their decision calculus the true cost of carbon, including in innovation. So if we have a carbon tax and we set price of carbon right, then we induce carbon-saving innovation. Everybody understands that, right? Everybody nod their head. Of course we need a carbon tax to induce the right pattern of innovation. Okay. What I've just said is the market for low-skilled labor is distorted by orders of magnitude to make low-skilled labor way too expensive in rich countries. What does that do? It creates every incentive to displace low-skilled labor with machines. So the real threat to low-skilled labor and machines is the lack of migration. Because the lack of migration induces firms to invent machines to drive out low-skilled labor. So I don't know how people are worried about low-skilled migration when I walk into Home Depot and can't find somebody to ring out my purchases because they've all been displaced by machines. If we had rotational labor programs where Home Depot could hire reliable workers in adequate quantities, they wouldn't be investing what they're investing in creating high technology machines to displace them. So the real threat to the low-skilled in America, the domestic low-skilled in America, is the maintenance of migration restrictions that make it so that firms invent labor-saving machines. What we have on the planet today is the highest skilled talent in the world are devoted to economizing on the most abundant factor in the world. We have Elon Musk and the Google twins, they're not really twins, but you know, the Google twins and all the richest people on the planet trying to invent self-driving trucks. Like, how is that not a scandal? The self-driving truck is going to destroy 4 million jobs in America. And why are they doing it? Because they can't find enough people to drive trucks. There's 1 billion people on the planet that would drive trucks in America if we let them. So the real skill to the low skill is lack of migration. That's my argument. Might not be right, but it's an argument.
Please join me in thanking Lant for being here, and I hope that you have lots of things to argue about over dinner tonight.
Thank you.